So, good evening. Welcome to the WZB. For those of you who are here the first time, the WZB is a large social science research institute. We have political scientists, sociologists, economists. The economists, and I will come back to that in a minute, sort of specialized in behavioral economics. There's roughly 150 researchers working here and 150 support staff. We're part of the Leibniz Society. We are in a courtroom tonight. I should just flag that because it seems particularly appropriate for tonight's event. This was when Bismarck introduced the social security reforms, the court handling cases arising from that. So let me introduce my guests tonight. So my co-host tonight is Anna Winger, who you know from Deutschland 83 and 86 and 89 to come soon. And our guests from the Better Call Saul team are Jenn Carroll and Gordon Smith. If you join me in giving them a hand. Now I should say, I'm really particularly pleased that this is taking place. I went back to my emails. This evening has been in the making since at least October 2012. I think this is when we exchanged.
At least a couple of those years were my fault for not quite having my passport up to snuff. So, but we made it this time.
Yeah. So let me, before we get started, say a little bit about the rules tonight. We're aiming at 75 minutes for the whole thing. We will allow questions on the way if they are, to the point, right, of the discussion. I will try to reserve also some time at the very end for questions, on topics that we haven't touched upon. Right? So if you have a question, really urgent question, but the discussion doesn't, come to the point where it's appropriate, then just wait a little. After we finish, there will be a little reception outside with water and wine and some snacks. So feel welcome to stay. Okay, so I mentioned behavioral economics, and there is an entire episode, 303, that takes its cues from behavioral economics. It's called sunk costs. The sunk cost fallacy, for those of you who, it's explained already in season 2, I think in the first episode of season 2. The sunk cost fallacy is people's tendency not to give up on investments once they have done them. You start an investment, you're optimistic, and then you get some feedback, and you realize that you really should, get out of it. But rather, you feel attached to it, and you keep going, and you throw good money after bad. In this episode, 303. The discussion comes at the very end between Kim and Jimmy. And it appears on the surface that it's about his case after his infringement of the law. But I was wondering whether this is not the first time where Kim actually has some doubts about the relationship.
I think that's probably accurate, yeah. She has some doubts, but interestingly, she phrases them as her conviction, like, why are you here? Well, sunk costs. This is, I guess, I'm pursuing this because, she's aware in some way that she's throwing good effort after bad, but at the same time, her emotional stakes, her emotional investment is such that she's going to keep pursuing it.
So she is still optimistic that this can work out after all?
I think she's still optimistic, and I think for both of them, they're still optimistic that this could work, even though the signs get more and more stacked against them as they go, that there's really a path that they could follow.
Especially at the end of season 4, when I think for the first time, Kim realizes that Jimmy can pull a con on her in a certain way. Like she was so invested in their relationship because she knew the true, wonderful guy beneath some of the bad business, but at the very end, when he tricks even her, I think she starts to wonder, and we'll see going forward in the series, should perhaps she have pulled out? Like maybe she's poured too much in and sunk too much into their relationship.
And I think that is something we talk about the fallacy of sunk costs constantly in the room. It has come up many times, but the interesting thing about it is, I suppose we can all, if we were all perfect economically rational actors, we would be very aware of all of our transactions and very aware of the sort of the economic stakes of things from an outsider's perspective. But and then you'd be willing to say, oh well, this is clearly the fallacy of sunk costs that I'm pursuing in my personal life. I should cut this off. But we don't have that kind of view of ourselves, which sort of prevents us from being purely rational actors and kind of keeps perpetuating the fallacy of sunk costs, keeps perpetuating those cycles that you pursue. And I think that's one of the things that happens with a lot of our characters, where they're aware that something has gone, that something's wrong, and that there's been a mistake here. This next murder will totally solve that problem. This next, this next crime that I commit, just one more and I'm done, and then I'll have solved the problem. I'll have gotten past the fallacy of sunk costs. But of course, that is the fallacy of sunk costs. So they're, at the same time that they're trying to get out of those webs, they're continuing them in a certain way.
Going back to Breaking Bad, Jesse calls Walt out on it very later in the series, because they keep saying, oh, one more and then we're out. We're done cooking meth. We've provided for our families. We can be done now. And finally, Jesse calls him out on it and says, you keep promising that, and it's not true any single time. So I think we started talking about the fallacy back on that show, even before we started on Better Call Saul. And it's been our guiding principle, which I don't know what that says about our team.
That's nice.
We will come back to the end of season 4 later, but at the beginning of season 4, there seems to be almost sort of bliss at home. No? I mean, they get along very well. And it's just when Jimmy feels the itch and starts off organizing the theft of the Bavarian Shepherd boy, to which we will also get back later. That things start to turn sour a little. So I was wondering about two things. A, how much duplicity can a relationship endure? We all know that perfect honesty might not be the best strategy in a relationship all the time. And the other thing is, what kind of world would make them happy? Is it thinkable that
Yes.
they could live happily ever after?
I wish they could live happily ever after. That's something that we kind of would hope for the characters, obviously, but I'm not sure what world it would be. It's almost a question of what they're carrying with them. It's one of those wherever you go, there you are. You carry your own problems to each circumstance. So I think when you talk about Jimmy sort of starting to feel that itch, I feel like, especially in season 4, that itch is driven by a sense that he has of himself as being a bad person, that he feels the guilt of his brother's death, and he feels that weight, which he can't share with anybody else. He feels that that's the ultimate sign that he is a horrible person and unredeemable. And because of that, he starts causing these problems. I feel like that itch is the thing that he starts taking out into the world to do bad things for no good reason, for really self-destructive purposes. And I feel like as long as that secret is within him, I don't know where he could take it or what circumstances he could take it to be happy. So, I think I don't know that they need pure transparency between the two of them as a relationship in order to be happy, but I think that secret is so toxic that it's at the center of him, and it's like, how do you relate to somebody else? As RuPaul says, if you don't love yourself, how are you going to love someone else? So I feel like Jimmy needs to take a little bit of RuPaul's advice to kind of be able to circumnavigate his relationship.
I think one of the questions especially as we go forward into season 5 of the show, is we understand why Kim loves Jimmy, but there's a question of whether Kim could ever love Saul Goodman. Because I think when we started the show, one of the central question is not what will happen to Jimmy, because we all have seen Breaking Bad, and so we know where he winds up. And so the story is more about the journey, and I think you once put it as the battle for Jimmy's soul is the question, like, how could he become this terrible person that we see, that seems to have no scruples at all in Breaking Bad when we meet this, younger, lovable version of himself. And I think as the show has gone on, Jimmy is sort of less the moral center, and the central question, for me at least, has become, what's going to happen to Kim's soul? Because the more she gets intertwined with Jimmy, and the more, the more she stands behind him, you have to wonder, is she going to get dragged down that path? Like, does she enjoy doing these cons with him so much that it compromises her own character when she's so... she's such the moral center right now. What does it mean for them to use their powers for good when what their powers are is taking advantage and conning people, even if it's for good reasons? So for me, I'm so worried for her that she's going to follow Jimmy down this path to Saulita Goodman. That would be. And I feel like, to that point, for when we were watching Deutschland 83, there's the same question of dramatization of the narrative, because you know that the final episode is not going to end in nuclear annihilation. Like, Europe is still going to be there. So how do you dramatize a story where you already know the ending? You have to get yourself so invested in Jimmy or Martin's story that what you just care about the journey of how they get to the end, and it doesn't matter that you know what happens with Abel Archer. Though at the time you're writing it, people didn't really know all the details of Abel Archer as much.
Oh, gosh, I haven't thought about 83 in a long time. But yes, that's true. But I would say more generally about the whole show as a trilogy, because you actually know that it ends with the wall coming down. So there's a kind of built-in end point, so that even though all these people are fighting to keep their reality alive, it's not going to work out. So yeah, that's sort of, that was actually one thing that attracted me to the material, because in a funny way, people only see that as a happy ending for the world, but it was like not a happy ending for everybody, and so it was exploring kind of the different ways in which we sort of approach the end of something. But there's a lot of television writers in the audience, and can I ask a question of them? Yeah, I don't want to interrupt. Oh, okay. Sure. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your process and about what each of you are doing on the show, just because you're a couple and you work together, which of course really interests me, and since I work with my husband. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how you work together.
You go.
So Gordon and I work in 2 different fields in the Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul world. So I'm a producer, and I started season 4 of Breaking Bad in post-production, and then sort of rose up the ranks as an assistant for many years. And then on Better Call Saul, I became an associate producer, and then I recently was a co-producer on El Camino, the movie we did for Netflix. So my job is a lot of logistics in a sense. So it's my job to keep the train on the rails. So I spend a lot of time in Albuquerque, helping Vincent Peter, our showrunners, on set, making sure that all the information with respect to costumes and props and locations gets to the right people, so that on the day when we're shooting, everybody has everything that they need.
Yeah, they're deeply, obsessively meticulous people by nature, both Vince and Peter, and so
in a good way.
In a good way, mostly in a good way.
Talk about the cart. You have to say about the cart.
Yes, we will. I will talk about that. But they, there's a lot of throughput of information about any given prop and every detail. And since the show is shot in Albuquerque, which is about 800 miles from Los Angeles, which is where the writer's office and the post-production office are. So there's a lot of kind of games of telephone and making sure that the information that you send out is the information that gets there in the way that it is meant to get there, and then that back and forth is very particular, and so Jenn is crucial in that regard.
Thank you. And we also have our writers on set, which are there, like our producers, to help have a more global view of both the series and the season, because we have guest directors come in, some of whom are your writers or producers on the show. Like Gordon directed for the first time this upcoming season 5. And so the producers and writers are there to say, you know, this is how this episode fits within a much larger picture, whereas each director their job is just to focus very specifically on making sure that that episode is perfect within itself. We help see the whole season at a time.
Yeah. So let's see. So what I do, I'm one of the writers on the show. Like Jenn, I started as an assistant. I worked my way up, got staffed on this show. So what do I do? So we have a room of 7 writers, I think. So it's 7 writers and the writer's assistant. So the writer's assistant, I'm not sure how rooms tend to work here, but we have, the writer's assistant takes notes. So they keep track of all the pitches. They keep track of all the bits of dialogue, all the story points that are kind of put forward in the course of a day. So the writers are basically sitting around and pitching ideas to one another, to the showrunners, trying to figure out, exactly what happens next. We tend to work in a very, I don't want to say organic because I feel that word's overused, but it's almost an incredibly linear fashion. Because we'll do some architecture on the season as a whole, but it's fairly loose, and we will often discard it. So we don't break, like, okay, by this episode, this is going to happen, and by this episode, this is going to happen, or something like that. We'll sort of get an idea of things that we want to happen in the course of a season, and then we go and we'll start laying. We often refer to it as going brick by brick, and you'll just lay what's the next beat that this character should be in. To me, it almost feels like the process is more backward-facing than forward-facing. It's instead of saying how do we get a character to a point in the story, we'll say, okay, well, this character has gone through this, and this. Okay, what's the next thing that character needs to do? Never mind what we want them to do, but what's the next thing that makes sense based on everything that we know about them? And then we'll ask, is there anything we're forgetting about that? And is there a piece that some small moment that changes their trajectory that we can factor in? And then, we start zeroing in on what exactly the next brick in the wall is, and then we keep doing that. And so as part of that process, then we get to when we're breaking an episode, we refer to it as when we're trying to figure out the story for the episode, we'll zero in on kind of what we really think it's going to be, and then it gets more and more detailed, and then finally we get to a point where everyone kind of agrees what the story is or what the scene is. Usually it's whatever piece that we're working on, and then it gets written down on 3x5 note cards. So it's not quite an outline, but it's pretty detailed. It's not as broad as many rooms are. So when you walk out of it, you could read the cards and have a pretty good sense of what the episode is going to be by the time it's done. You could, as long as you can understand the shorthand, which
And everyone has really good handwriting.
Uh,
Something I've always wanted to ask.
Well,
I saw pictures.
Some people, a lot of the cards on Breaking Bad. Vince did everything. Vince wrote virtually all the cards,
okay.
And he has incredible handwriting.
He has the handwriting of an architect.
He does.
Google it.
Beautiful.
He does.
It's amazing.
Yes.
And so on Saul, he has somewhat reluctantly, and he kind of doesn't want to look at it sometimes, but he's let the individual writer of the episode usually does their episode. It's been a big personal growth moment for him. But even so, when I tried to do my first, I was just like trying to practice writing a card, and everyone made fun of me. So I started practicing to make sure that my handwriting could get close, because you can't they're all going to go up there on the board, and you need to make sure that there's a certain degree of legibility, which I don't natively have. So
It looked like a ransom note.
It did look
a
a little like a
little
ransom
shake, just because you were a little nervous. But now Gordon's handwriting is
it's
flawless.
better.
10 episodes of
It's
yours
better.
later.
I've worked on it, is all.
And
You were mentioning that you know the end point because this is a prequel, and similarly in Deutschland '89, we know that or will know that the wall will eventually come down. So I guess in some sense, if you in Better Call Saul season 1, there's a lot of things happening. We know we are far away still from Breaking Bad and this. But as the show progresses, you get less and less wiggle room in some sense, right? And this is the same with Deutschland. You get less and less wiggle room because you know that somehow the story has to lead to something that everybody knows already. So maybe you can tell it, both of you or all of you can tell a little about sort of how it feels when the room is getting tighter.
Yeah. The one thing I guess we have that we have in reserve always is that while it is a prequel that is going to collide headlong into our parent series in time, the character that we are primarily focused on Saul lives at the end of that. Unlike many of the other characters on Breaking Bad, he lives and he escapes to another
There
life.
is an element of a sequel as well,
Yes.
right?
Yes, so
With
there's
all
an
the
element of
black
a
and
sequel
white.
as well, and we have kind of carefully nourished in our heads and in our story to the best of our ability, at least the sense that his journey isn't done once he is sort of becomes full Saul Goodman. That there's some space to uncover what does it mean to live after that? What does the sequel of that look like? What is the journey? Hopefully to me at least there's a degree of hope to that, which is if the series that we've been having mostly is the decline of Jimmy McGill into Saul Goodman, we know that the state of complete decadence that is him managing a Cinnabon in Omaha is at least it's a different person. It feels like it's a different state of his. So that change that seems inexorable and final, that's not his final state. He has another state. So that says to me that people can change. That says to me that process is not one that ends, right? That it can continue. So if it can continue in one direction, then change is possible for him. So I don't know what that change would look like because we don't really, as I say, we know we have some ideas about where the series ends, but we haven't done the work yet to kind of figure out what it actually looks like. So.
And we know remarkably little about his home life in Breaking Bad. Like, we know what he presents as his working persona, but we never really see where he lives. We see him once in maybe a jumpsuit that seems to be his leisure attire. But since that other show was so through the lens of Walter White, you only saw things from his point of view. We don't know a lot about who Saul really is in that series. So I think there's a lot of room to discover before the end of this series.
But one thing that we do know is there's no more Kim. Right? And,
well, do we?
Do we?
Because
yeah.
we don't know his home life, so there's always a chance.
But Kim is cooking dinner at home.
Yes. Well, what we always say is that if you were Saul Goodman and you had someone you cared about and was as wonderful as Kim, would you introduce her to Heisenberg? And be like, "Hi, honey, here's this murderer that I work with. Like, let's all have dinner." So maybe there's hope, at least in my heart.
So as you say, as the walls are closing in on us, I think we go, no, but wait, the walls aren't closing in. We try and find these patches of sunlight that we can look to and say, well, here's some other avenues for story, or here's some other things that we want to challenge those assumptions that are like, no, there's nothing to be learned about the character, or there's nothing to be learned about the situation, so that we can at least keep that flame alive, that there's something to explore for us.
Vince mentioned in an interview in 17 that if there was another spin-off, it could be a Kim Wexler.
Right.
Spin-off.
Yes.
So she's but many people on the internet think that she's doomed. That death will wait for her. So that's two very different
I would love a show that was all about Kim, not for the least reason because Ray Seahorn, who plays her, is the most wonderful and disciplined actress. She does more homework than probably any other actor, I would say. She makes a graph for her character's journey for every episode. If you see one of her scripts, she's marked it up with notes in the margins like a crazy person, but she's brilliant.
Very detailed.
And I think everyone around her wants to rise to that level of investment in the work, and I think she really inspires people because she cares so very much about Kim's journey and putting a background to it that I think is why people want to see a Kim show and want the best for her, because she's created such a three-dimensional character.
And she is enjoying these cons that she does with Jimmy. And I mean, you said, oh, this is Better Call Saul is a story of decline. Yes, of Jimmy's decline. It's maybe moral decline, but in Breaking Bad, he feels. I mean, you look at him and you think there is somebody feeling at ease with himself. So this moral decline is juxtaposed with some, finding identity.
Yes.
And that is, when I think about Kim, and I read that, I imagined a Kim Wexler spin-off. I was wondering, I mean, because she has, a similar. I mean, not only that she also was in the mailroom and had an unorthodox way to the law, but she also has this enjoyment of the con. And I mean, when we go to Breaking Bad, of course, Walter gets better and better feeling about himself the more he is in command. So there seems to be something like the invigorating power of power.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I mean, is it too simple to say this is a story of decline, and what kind of personal growth could Kim experience when she really finds the Jimmy in herself?
Yes, no, I agree. I think that saying it's just a story of decline is an oversimplification. I think a lot about we've used the analogy often about the mask that you put on becoming who you are. In a sense, it does remind me, partially because I'm in Berlin, of Brecht's play *The Good Person of Szechuan*, where the mask becomes the person, and as Shantae becomes Shuita, she becomes more powerful, and that's the weird, as you say, the power of power that you experience. And I think Saul Goodman is a much more powerful character than Jimmy McGill. He's a higher status character than Jimmy McGill. Everybody knows Saul Goodman, in the world. They may know him as a bad person, but they know him, and so that some of those trajectories of our lives kind of flip-flop around those different notions. So I think hopefully that's what keeps it interesting, is it's not just a question of like, oh, he's becoming a bad person, but that again, he's becoming. There may be a moral decline that is accompanied by getting wealthy, getting power, getting notoriety, getting all of these things that you seem to want in the world. Even his relationship with Kim is not. We constantly go back to the point, like his relationship with Kim in the first season. It seems like he has an interest in her, and it seems like maybe they have kind of a flirtatious history, but it's not until season 2 when he sort of declares himself outside of the parameters of being bound by kind of moral obligations that he actually has the nerve to say, hey, is this going to happen between us? And so, and at first it's like it's not going to happen until they pull a con together. And so it was actually exposing her to some small degree of his dirty underbelly that cemented that relationship and continues to cement that relationship. So I don't know. People have asked us sort of like, can Kim be with Saul Goodman? If he ever becomes a fully integrated person that is Saul Goodman, can their relationship survive? The question is almost, could it survive if he just went back to being Jimmy McGill? Would that endure if he just said, no, I'm just going to be a simple lawyer who's like struggling in the trenches, and I'm not going to do anything bad ever again? I'm not sure that he would have that relationship at all, I think. So.
Just to add to one thing you said earlier about the mask becoming the man, one of the philosophical points that you and the other writers discuss a lot is the question of, are you who you are or are you what you do? And I think we want to believe with Jimmy that he's a good person, but he keeps doing these bad things. And that was the question about Walter White for a very long time too. Like he was the hero of the story, and so everyone, even Vince will say, even his own mother was saying like, oh, Walt's a good person. Everyone around him is bad. But when you actually do an inventory of all of the things he's done, he's terrible. And by the end of Breaking Bad, I think we all felt like he's not a hero. Don't defend him. We don't want to be living with that. And so I think the question about decline is if you feel like you're a good person the whole way through, do you feel like you are in decline, or are you able to justify away some of the bad things that you've done?
Are you looking at
No, not you.
those bad
You're
things
great.
you've done?
And one other moment from Saul that I think is telling of that question is in that flash forward, one of the black and white sequences in Omaha, the Cinnabon, when he's alone in the trash room and he carves into the wall, SG was here. It's as in Saul Goodman was here, and it's this moment that feels pivotal to me because he is thinking back on himself as Saul and not. It's not JM, as in Jimmy McGill was here.
And it's
I think
also not Gene.
Right.
What's his
exactly.
last name?
Yes. So it's not GT was here. It's specifically Saul, and I think that's interesting to me to see what it means to him that he is identifying most proudly of that in that moment.
I mean, that's something we talk about a lot also, because we're talking about people who, in some cases, are long-term undercover. And the question is, at what point does your cover life, one thing that always interested me when we first started researching the Stasi was that they had more than 2,000 Westagenten, which is like West agents at the time of the fall of the wall, who were like living in West Germany under assumed identities, and suddenly their country was gone. And then what happens? It's like they have fake marriages, fake jobs, fake careers. Are they fake? Do they just blend into the lives that they've created as a cover?
Right.
Like, then what happens? And so I think building up to that really has in general, as an idea, that really interests me. Like, at what point do you become the person that you've created, and what does it really mean? What is identity anyway? I mean, these are large philosophical questions, but I think it's really interesting. I have another practical question, which is, when you decide to do a prequel and the characters are like not that young, the actors, you've been doing this now for how many, like 5 seasons, right? So that's like 6 years. Aging.
It's tricky.
Yeah.
It's tricky with children most of all. We've had to swap out Kaylee Ehrmantraut many times.
We have.
Because she can't age too much. A double problem with switching from Breaking Bad to Better Call Saul was not just setting it, 4 years in advance of the other show, was that we switched from film, which is a very forgiving medium, to 4K HD digital,
You're
which
suddenly
is
like every pimple, every wrinkle,
exactly. Suddenly, it changed so much of our workflow on the show, not just because you could suddenly see the actors so much more closely, but because suddenly you could see every prop. And so before we could have fake text on everything, lorem ipsum, whatever. Suddenly we had to create almost a whole department within our writer's room that was generating all of this copy, so that if you pause when you're watching the show, you can look and see
all these stupid
like
documents.
this.
Yes.
On your
Yes, the actors love it because it helps add authenticity to their world when they open up a folder and suddenly there's a true to life case document. But it is a pressure on the team.
Yeah, I'm not. We do the best we can, I think, because also the clock on the show, on both shows, it's actually very compressed. Like we kind of do, it's not real time by any means, but it's an episode will chart the course of a few days or something like that.
Right.
And then the next episode begins immediately thereafter and kind of keeps going at those pace. So our just keeping the clock going where, it's been 6 years of this world's time, and I think we've done
A year
and a half, I think,
of
something like
story
that,
time.
of story time, and with a couple,
Yeah.
and those are mostly over a couple of big time jumps that spanned 8 months here, 9 months there, things like that.
But that's actually what we jumped years.
Right.
Yeah.
For exactly that reason, because when you're writing a season, in the end, it just doesn't cover that much time.
Yeah.
Not as much time as it somehow feels in your imagination. And when you really add it up, you're like, okay, maybe we've covered 4 months, but that's also a stretch. What were they doing all the time in the middle? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then it ends up, it's like, well, how could we possibly ever get to 1989?
Oh, yeah.
It just got,
Yes.
Yeah.
When we were doing El Camino, we had this trickiness of it's starring Aaron Paul, but it picks up almost exactly where Breaking Bad ended. Now maybe 7 years before we.
2013, in like February of 2013.
Right. And so then we picked it up last year. And so quite a bit of time had passed. Luckily, Aaron Paul, very beautiful. And he had not aged a day. But we also jump around within time within the movie and we do these flashbacks. And so we were very lucky to have this wonderful wig maker and hair and makeup team because we had to make him look like he looked season 3 of the show. We had to make him look like he looked at in the final season, and he had just come from another project where he had to have his head completely shaved, and then we needed him to have a full head of hair and a beard, and the beard had to be placed on by hand because of how much the digital camera sees, because it was so high definition. And so he spent 2 hours in the makeup chair having a beard put on, hair by hair every morning, and a multi-piece wig. And luckily on Better Call Saul, we have the same thing where we have a wonderful hairstylist for Bob to create these looks for him and have consistency through the seasons.
Something that has actually helped us a bit is actually inconsistencies, because we've had, not with our main players, but with kind of characters that come back who have lived their lives in a period of time. But now and their bodies have changed and they look a little different. But when you bring them back, it almost feels like you can say like, oh, well, they've lost weight or they've gained weight. Either way, that was the past. You know what I mean? It's different from what they were established in Breaking Bad, so that those changes make you feel, you don't necessarily chart as much what the change is, but something has changed. So you can kind of go, oh, okay, that character must have, they gained weight between the past and the present, or they lost weight between the past and the present, but either way.
it was last Thursday, but whatever.
Right, exactly.
So talking about some of the technical complexity of El Camino, there was one scene I was really keen on talking to you about, and that's the search of Todds' swanky bachelor pad, where basically the entire place is totally ripped apart.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you can tell us a little about how it was shot, but also a little about how sort of the emotional impact. I felt reminded when I went to London the beginning of the 2000s. There was a show in London by an artist called Michael Landy, and it was called, I think, Breakdown. And what he did is he took all his possessions, everything he owned, and then destroyed it on Oxford Street in a shop. People could go there, and there was the conveyor belt, and every single item that he owned was destroyed, and you could watch it. And I felt a little reminded of that when I was watching it, because somehow it had this, what do possessions mean for people?
Yes, that scene, like other scenes that we've seen in Better Call Saul, like when Chuck is tearing the house apart looking for electricity at the end of season 3, were inspired by the conversation. Gene Hackman? Yes, Gene Hackman in that movie. It's something that I think Vince and Peter there's is the idea of doing the process of that search, tearing apart every single one is to the point of almost madness is something that I don't know what it says about us, but it's something that we've been drawn to several times. And practically, that scene was so fun to put together because we had 3 stages of this apartment that we built, Todd's apartment, which was interesting to build because we had never seen Todd's home life before. On Breaking Bad, he was a bit of a mystery. You know, he was a very polite and friendly young man who also seemed to have no problem with murder. And so he was a bit of an enigma. And then when it came to this movie, we had to decide, what does that person look like behind closed doors? And we wound up with the most bizarre apartment that is Easter egg colored at front. And if you look at the walls, Judy Rhee, our production designer, chose wallpaper that had very interesting patterns on it. It looks like one color, but when you get close, it is a pattern that mimicked human skin across this. I know, it's disgusting. And the idea of the apartment was that when you first walk in, it's normal, it's bright, it's sunny, it's cheerful, and the deeper you get into it, the more the madness begins to show, until finally you get back to his bedroom and the floor looks like MC Escher and the walls are blood red and there's this chair that looks like a scorpion. And you think, like, who is this guy who chose these things for his home life? There was a version of the apartment that was even crazier, where his walls were purple shag carpeting, but we pulled it back to just this level of madness. And we had 3 versions of the apartment. We built it, and we didn't realize until we were shooting it that there's only one scene that takes place in the apartment as it would normally stand. It's the one where it's a flashback, and Jesse is inside, and they see the body. Sorry for spoilers for folks who have not seen it. And so you see the apartment put together, and then immediately you cut to a different version of the apartment that has been torn apart by police search. And the tricky thing for us was, how do we differentiate between the police search, which is very thorough, and Jesse's search, which is one step beyond thorough into madness. And so that's how we got to the pulling of the walls. You know, we needed to break him, because that point had to be the lowest point for him emotionally in the movie. And the way that we showed that was to, show how far he's gone for this search. It is his only hope. He needs to find this money inside this apartment or else he's dead. And so we filmed this beautiful montage, and then we put this incredibly chaotic music on top of it, which was actually 2 pieces that Vince had the idea. As we listened to maybe 10 pieces that Thomas Galjevich, our music supervisor, sent to us, and there were 2 pieces we really liked that were both very unnerving. And we were sitting in the editing room, and Vince said, well, what if you just put them together? And our editor said, oh, you don't want to do that, because they weren't on the same metric. They were on the same meter, and so they didn't line up. And so we did it anyway, and you just put both layers in, and we listened to it, and we were silent afterward. And our assistant editor just said, oh, I don't want to be that guy. It just tears. It was. I had to leave the room listening to it a few times, and it made our music editor so wildly uncomfortable. But he found a way to make it work. And so you're watching him tear apart this place to this maddening music. And you just feel broken for him. Like it truly helps you feel the lowest point. And before that crazy double music, second part of the montage, there's one shot that I think is the most memorable visual in the movie, which is a God's eye point of view shot looking down at the apartment, which Judy, again, built the apartment to be exactly the 2:3:5 size of the frame, so that when you are looking down on it, because we knew we were going to do this shot, the apartment perfectly fills the frame, almost like a doll's house. And Judy would refer to this as the mouse maze shot, because she wanted Jesse to feel trapped, and so she wanted him to feel like a mouse caught in a maze within the house. And so we did this shot where we mounted the camera way up in the perms, 6 stories up, and then just let Aaron loose inside the apartment to just go mad. And Vince had a microphone, like a karaoke microphone, and would just say, Aaron, go to this room, do this, like tear apart the speakers, kick the speaker, like pull it for about 3 hours, and one unbroken take.
And how long is the finished
It is about 11 seconds, but it's a beautiful 11 seconds where all these Jessies are running around. It was the last day before a holiday break, and I think we had all just lost it. But Aaron Paul never complained once.
When Chuck destroys his house,
Yes.
the music choice is quite different.
Yeah.
It's very serene and
Yeah.
almost celebratory.
Yeah, well, I think they're reaching different points, since that's the moment. That feels like that's Chuck letting go in a certain way of his of whatever hope is left to him. I think because he hasn't come to terms with his own psychological damage. I think, and I think he can't let it. He can't believe that it's something that he carries with him. There must be something in the world that's the problem. It must be something. And as he destroys that house, it's not the world, the world's not the thing that's against him, it's him. And I think there's a terrible peace that comes with that takes his life in the end of that sequence. So I think it's a sadness that's very different.
Talking about things, you wrote 4 or 3, something beautiful. I promised to get back to the Bavarian.
Yes.
I mean, it appears that this whole plot about the theft of the Hummel figurine, that seems to contemplate the meaning, value, and price of things. And there are 2 objects that feature prominently. It's the shepherd boy, but it's also a vacuum cleaner.
Yes.
And
Yes.
And that story tells you that sometimes expensive gifts might not be
The right. That's right. That's right. Yes, absolutely. The vacuum cleaner that gets the guy who runs the copy shop kicked out of his house is a very nice vacuum, but
Never loses suction.
Never loses suction, but it's the wrong vacuum cleaner for his wife. Does not appreciate the gift, which we hear through the ears of the guy who is breaking in to steal his very valuable Hummel figurine.
That's my favorite scene, perhaps, of the series. Not for the vacuum losing suction line, which I think is your favorite line you've ever written for the show. But there's the magic flute.
Yes.
But my favorite line in that scene is "sliced, please," which is when he's ordering pizza. It's a reference to the pizza on Breaking Bad that it appears to you unsliced to pass the savings on to you. We went and got pizza yesterday that was unsliced.
We did.
So
Here.
Yes.
Here.
It's never sliced.
Which,
As Americans are always shocked by that.
yes.
Yeah.
No, but I'm worried that joke doesn't play
Right.
anymore. It's like, of course it
I'd
would
like
be
to ask you a
sliced.
question just about working in this multi-layered universe of the same characters in different kind of dimensions. Because now at this point, it's been, many years that you've worked with sort of this constellation of this fictional world in different ways, right?
11.
And in 3 different projects now, right?
We would never do it again. I'm sure you feel the same way. There's just so much to remember.
Well, I've only done one. That project is just 3 seasons. You guys have done so much. And do you feel like now, having done it like this and now done El Camino, do you feel like there's just so many more places that the same characters can take you, or do you have the desire to make other things up, or do you not? What's that feel like?
It is a bit overwhelming in a certain way, because you're just, there's this detail and I have to remember this detail, and Jenn has gone through both shows so many times with a fine-tooth comb to just pull out details to keep track of, so that we can
Have this
things
meta
together.
references and stuff.
Yeah, and have references that we can for a variety of purposes, because the show doesn't just live on screen. There's people that are, there's books and things and people on and all that stuff that you have to keep track of. And I find it overwhelming sometimes to just how much the weight of history starts to get pretty heavy on the shows. But it still feels like until we're done, I think I'm happy to feel like we're within sight of some kind of okay, we can tell this story. That's the thing that kind of draws me through it. It's like, all right,
Gordon, you must
got one more story to go.
Gordon, you must have felt this weight when you wrote your first ever episode, for which you then got an Emmy nomination. Because so this is 5 episode 5.0. It's the 6th episode in one.
Of season one.
Of season 1, where you tell the backstory of Mike. And I mean, we all know Mike from Breaking Bad, and he's sort of slightly enigmatic.
Yeah.
And there you are now being tasked with, in some sense, explaining. So this must have been, on the one hand, extreme luxury, because you can, wander off in this episode, and it's self-contained in many ways. But on the other hand, you must have felt a burden.
Yes, I did.
This is the first episode you ever wrote?
Yes.
But on Breaking Bad, you wrote other episodes?
No, I did not. I was the writer's assistant on Breaking Bad. So I was
the whole way through it?
Well, no, for the last 2 seasons, and then I started as a PA on Breaking Bad.
Sorry. So I should know. I
No.
Googled this. I'm sorry.
That's it.
I didn't understand that. So you literally have worked on Breaking Bad since the beginning?
No, I started season 3 as a PA, and then in the office, and then I was Vince's assistant season 4, and then I was the writer's assistant for the last 2 seasons, and then I got staffed on Saul, and so my first script was the script that Steffen is.
That was nominated for an Emmy.
Yeah,
it's a very
That's
nice
pretty
thing for
cool.
your bio.
I was very lucky. I've been very. I've had a large number of strokes of luck in my life that, I have no responsibility for. But yes, I did feel quite a bit of. It was very nerve-wracking. It was very nerve-wracking for that to be the first assignment out of the gate. It was because we kind of knew as we were breaking things, the way we kind of assign the scripts, it's because we don't do a kind of, here's what the season looks like, you don't really know what your episode is going to be until you're in it.
Wow.
So you start breaking, and there's kind of a loose sense of what the order is going to be for the assignments, but you don't really know until it's done, until you've broken it. And so we were getting to this point, and it was like seeming like, oh yeah, that's going to be this episode where we get into Mike's backstory, because we'd been putting it off for 4 episodes at that point, 5 episodes, I guess, eventually. And so it was like, oh, this is going to be your episode, and I'm like, oh. Okay, that's great. It's a great, I'm interested to find out about this character, but there was just such a high concern that, that I was going to screw it up, and that they lose the faith that the showrunners had put in me to, staff me in the first place and all of that stuff. So it was my fingers are a little sweaty at the memory. So.
I do wonder how people will think about Mike who watched Better Call Saul before Breaking Bad, because that's always the question that we have for the audience, which is which show do you watch first? And if you watch Better Call Saul first, Mike is just the guy in the booth.
once it's both finished, what would you recommend? Would you recommend to watch? What would be the doctor's order?
Yes, do you do it in story order? I think I would recommend Breaking Bad first, just for the gene of it, like the Omaha story. I'm not sure that I think that you might learn too much about the events of Breaking Bad through those flash forwards. And I'm biased because that's the way I learned the story.
No, I think if you did it strictly chronologically, I think it would be just utterly incoherent. Because I think the earliest pieces would be things with like Jimmy is a child in a shop in Chicago. And,
breaking up the episode.
Like if you just said completely chronologically.
God, that's interesting.
And I think it would
totally
just wouldn't. I don't think it would be. I don't think the kind of thematic and dramatic points would be emphasized very well if we did.
But since you mentioned the scene, so is this the first time? So this is 207 inflatable.
Yeah.
So. Where we see in this flashback him stealing money from his dad. After I think in the episode before that, it's Chuck accusing Jimmy vis-a-vis Kim that he stole money from. We never know whether this is actually true.
Right.
So I was wondering about that scene. This is the first time that he's doing that. Is this the first time that he's doing this? Because
I think so. Yeah. It seems like it's
he identifies the con man. The con man says, one thing, there are wolves and there are sheep, and so he takes a decision there. But is he then, what is unclear to me, does he keep doing it? Is Chuck's story true?
Well, I think the thing...
Can we make up our own mind about this?
I think we can make up our own mind. I think the truth lies somewhere between that flashback, which doesn't just tell us that Jimmy steals from Chuck. It tells us that Chuck's dad gives away money to the people in the neighborhood. Chuck's dad is a good-hearted, believes the con and doesn't really want to interrogate it, right? He wants to say, oh, this person comes in, he's a person in need. Whether or not he's telling me the truth, it's sort of immaterial, and he gives him money. And so I think if you were to ask Jimmy, he might say, hey, all of these people in the world, all of these, these wolves in the world ate his father's shop alive. And he wouldn't necessarily interrogate his own role in that as much. I took a buck here, I took a buck there. It was not stealing out from underneath my dad. Whereas Chuck, I think, would focus much more on Jimmy's moral obligation to his father rather than, the other people in the neighborhood who were clearly taking money from him at the same time. So I don't know that I would. I think the truth lies somewhere in between those two polarities.
When you talk about their father's empathy and his altruism, giving money away, and maybe being a bit naive about this, which Jimmy certainly is not. But when we look at his actions throughout Better Call Saul, maybe with the exception of the very end of season 4, we see him as really an empathy monster. He has so much empathy. And I was wondering, with empathy, it's probably a good thing to be a con man because you really have to understand how people tick. And empathy is helpful when you're a lawyer. So, being a con man and a lawyer. But the other profession where you need a lot of empathy, it struck me, is being a writer. But then I was wondering, how much of the con man do you find in yourself?
I'd rather have the con man than Heisenberg.
Well, I guess so.
I was going to ask you something similar, which is that the inspiration for all of these characters, are you news junkies? Is it sort of related to weird things you read on the internet? Is it your family story? Is it where do you find your or is it deeply inspired by itself because you have so much material to draw upon?
Sure. I think it's obviously a bunch of those things. I think family comes in very heavily because this story, both shows derive so much from kind of a center of a family and what those kind of sometimes broken family dynamics can do, and that people brought in from their relationships with their parents and step-parents and their relationships with siblings and so on and so forth. I think probably half the people in the room have siblings and half don't. And so the people that have siblings will kind of talk about their relationship with their siblings and how, some of those relationships are good or bad. I have two sisters who don't talk to each other, who have sort of had a break with one another and are completely estranged and have been for several years. And so it's that's an experience that I can kind of draw in to figure out how, Chuck and Jimmy could be with one another. And obviously, we do bring in random bits of news stories or other things that we try and find that, or not even try and find, but just that come to us and it's this is interesting. That feels like, this character, or that feels like this moment.
And of course, Jimmy and Kim are just playing out the relationship between the two of you.
Yes, right. No.
Oh God. Oh yes. We expire at the end of next.
Right.
I think in a more general sense, and I don't know if this is how you feel about writing, but a lot of the artists we work with suffer from a sort of imposter syndrome to that end, where they feel like they're not necessarily good enough at the work they're doing. And to your point about wolves and sheep, I think that many of the folks that I work with have this feeling of, when you move through the world, you either have to be a schmuck or an asshole, to just put it more crudely than that, which is that either you're someone who's being taken advantage of or you're someone who's taking advantage of others. And you don't want to be either, but you feel that it's a polarized choice. And I certainly feel that way when I'm trying to buy a car. I don't know what kind of negotiations you guys have here, but it is a very stressful process in the States where you just think that you're paying too much or you feel like you have to be a jerk to get a deal, then you're taking advantage of someone else. And I think that a lot of that comes in with the con, because you don't want to be the person who's being taken advantage of, and so you feel like you are forced to be the person who's taking advantage.
Or you don't want to be the person who missed an opportunity. Oh no, this is what an opportunity. Like that golden opportunity fell into my lap. How do if I miss it, then I'm a schmuck. Exactly. If I miss it, then I'm the idiot here. But
So the pressure to not be either one of those and to be a good person running the middle is I think, a simmering mindset that then shows up in the show in these ways.
But I think as a writer, it's easy to identify with people who are either pretending to be someone else or hiding in plain sight or any of these things, because, you're constantly in your imagination inhabiting other characters, right? So, I mean, in very simple terms, you're sort of, you feel that way in your daily life, right? Not in a bad way. It's just like you are sort of living multiple lives at the same time a little bit. You know? So it's easy to imagine what that might be like because you're in it.
I find for myself too, it's that that question of living another life. It's like, okay, well, what's the boring thing that this person can do? Because that's what I'm going to do. That's me. That's my choice in this. Oh, somebody has this choice in front of them. What's the boring? Okay, so I don't want them to do that. They can't do that. They have to do something else.
But that raises something that actually has came up. I was in LA the past couple of weeks, and one thing that came up quite a bit in my conversations with people is because of political correctness. Now there is this strong sense that you're supposed to only write your own story, and which is really. What I said many times is like I feel like my story is like friends from college or something. Like I have a totally boring life, and it's like who cares? I went to Ivy League college and lived in New York and then moved here. I've married, I have kids. It's boring. I don't want to write about that, So and no one wants to watch it, But I mean, like soccer mom, like that's not what engages my imagination.
Right. Yes.
So I think it's a very weird moment actually, where there's so much pressure that well, you can't possibly tell this story. I mean, I obviously read a show about East Germans. I never even went to East Germany. But I deeply identify with their mission and what they're doing, and I think it's for reasons that might not be visible to other people. But so what,
Yeah. It's a search for authenticity.
Yeah.
But there's a way to be authentic.
Yes.
If you come to something with an appreciation of it. And
I mean, you guys are clearly not con men. It's like
you don't know.
at every.
we got here.
You know what I mean? It's just a very weird conversation. The idea that everything should be one-to-one.
It is,
Yes.
It is. And I think that is, but
Fiction,
hopefully I think that the enduring power of empathy, of saying, okay, let me just imagine what does it mean to be in somebody else's shoes to the best degree that I can, and knowing that that's partial, and then hoping. I think that's one of the strengths of a writer's room model over. This sort of like auteur, everything coming out of one person's mind, is that you can be checked. And as long as you're open to that checking, as long as when you say, hey, this is my experience of the world, or this is what I imagine what that would be like, and someone says, you know what, actually I have a different, I am not you. We come at the world from these different points. Well, maybe we can triangulate what the truth is from that. What does my empathy tell me here? What does your empathy tell you? What does our experience tell us? And then it's a stronger model. It's more robust than just one person, because one person, everybody, I think Aaron Sorkin is a really great writer, but everyone sounds like Aaron Sorkin when they talk.
Crazy, right?
All the characters sound like Aaron Sorkin.
I mean, I love how Aaron Sorkin sounds.
No, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. But the limiting factor is that you kind of always see the singularity of it rather than the kind of the social connection of it, or the depth of it. In a sense of how many voices there can be. So,
but it's an unpopular position, or at least it's somehow become something vaguely difficult to discuss.
Sure.
Yeah. I think it comes from the feeling that so many diverse voices were suppressed for so long. So there's this instinct to try and elevate those, but then you're fighting two battles at once, and you're always fighting the last war. So if the last war was like the suppression of these voices in favor of a lot of middle-aged white male voices, then you're seeking out authenticity from these other voices. But if you're, like we said before, if you're coming at a project with love and with research, like how much you've done so much research for the 83, 86, 89 series that there's even though you perhaps didn't visit East Germany or East Berlin, you did so much work to create an authentic series.
But I think there's also something to be said for being interested.
Yes.
It's like, I'm not that interested in my own life. Someone else might be interested in things I've experienced, but I experienced them, so they're less interesting to me. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Whereas things I didn't experience really interest me. I mean, I think it's also that. And I also wonder sometimes if people, let's say people of color, let's use that as an example, like, why would you only want to write your experience? I mean, definitely there's a strong argument for wanting to write your experience, but like, nobody wants to be put in a pigeonhole like that either,
Right.
you know? So that's I think that's just an interesting moment.
It is a moment that I think will hopefully continue to sort itself out in a way that allows people to have the maximum flexibility of their creative expression. But,
Well, the good thing here is that you do have German actors to play the German crew.
we did have some German. Yes.
Who?
Yes.
Full authentic.
Rainer Bach.
Rainer Bach.
Ben Belleboom.
Ben Belleboom, yes, who's a Berliner himself.
That's great.
And Rainer, I think he lives in Munich.
Yes, yeah, they were wonderful. We were very excited to. It took a long time to get folks from who were Germans living abroad to be able to come to Albuquerque to shoot, just because it required a different sort of visa, especially for the length of time we needed them. And so we started the search for
We started looking very
Varner
early.
many months ahead of when we would normally be casting, just because we knew we wanted someone who was an actor in Germany, and he is fantastic. I wish he would be on more of the show, but
You killed him off.
unfortunately, yeah, Mike's story took precedence. But hopefully,
we're merciless. That's what
Yes.
it is.
Time's
Merciless.
been flying. I would like to open up for questions, if there are any. Michael. Wait a second for the microphone because of...
Thank you. I have a question to Gordon Smith.
Yes.
A while ago you talked about how you put an episode together. My question is, do you ever run into the fallacy of sunk cost? Of developing something and then you sort of feel, oh, we have to backtrack because it doesn't go anywhere?
Yes, absolutely. We will discard. We've had storylines that we really like, or scenes or things like that we've developed.
episode 108.
Or written even. So, yeah, episode 108, which was one that I wrote the first season, and we had kind of broken about half of the episode, and then we looked at it again when Vince was shooting the pilot, and he came in and looked at it and was like, I think this part isn't right, and we had to go back, and he's like, okay, let's try something else. Let's see what else we can do.
The problem was that it advanced Jimmy too far, especially for season 1. It advanced him too far towards Saul too quickly.
We didn't really know what the show was the first season, so we kept thinking, okay, next episode he's going to be calling himself Saul Goodman, and he's just going to be kind of in this state of moral decrepitude around the corner, and we just kept thinking that, and we kept thinking that until pretty much until the end of that first season. Actually, even to the beginning of season 2, we just thought we were going to be moving faster than we would be, and so we had to discard that. We've had it also. The scene that Steffen you mentioned from 207 with the flashback. That was actually a scene that was written and shot for something the previous
109.
season.
Really?
But
cuts.
we had to cut it for time, and so we just held on to it, and we held on to it in our heads, and then found another place to use it. So hopefully, when we've lost some of those things, when we've developed something, it often will kind of transform in a certain way and then appear somewhere else. We had on Breaking Bad, we had for months, for most of the time in season 5. we had at the end of the season, or it was at episode 8, we had this moment where we thought that the character of Hank would uncover Walt's, his criminal doings, and that he would tell Walt's wife, Skylar, and she would say, if that's who you think he is, take your best shot. And that she was going to stand by her husband, and like they were going to stand arm in arm against the DEA. And we thought that was sort of something that they were going to get to, that these two characters would be together. And we kept thinking it was going to happen, and we're like, yes, we're going to get there. And we got to that point, and it was like, we couldn't get the characters to move there. But then you do see some of the pieces, because we developed them so much and they'd been in our heads so much, they kind of came out in different form in the course of the next season when all of that information kind of came out into the light. So we will cut things off, but we also are conservative about it, and we don't want to throw away work that we really like. So we try and kind of figure out if there was something that was useful to salvage from it, rather than just sinking the cost, I guess.
An important lesson also that we learned back on Breaking Bad was if you have an exciting idea for a character, never tell the actor when they visit the writer's room. Because there was one time on Breaking Bad, and I think Vince has told this publicly, but Anna Gunn, who played Skylar, came and visited the writer's room to say hello in between seasons. And the writers had concocted this wonderful backstory about her, about Skylar as a child and her relationship with her father. And it was so well drawn. And it never shows up in the show. But they told her, this is a scene we've imagined, and with Marie and Skylar, and it's going to be so powerful, and we're so excited about it. And then it didn't fit anywhere. And she just kept waiting to see the script, and so then the show was over.
We very much learned to keep, like we take we have our walls of the office are covered with the boards with these note cards, and so we take them down when the actors come and turn them around. They don't see anything, unless we will occasionally put a joke up and put some joke about what happens to the character on the board and see if they notice. But other than that,
Walt and Jesse make out was one of them.
Things like that.
No one ever appreciated it, though. Yeah, it's too bad.
We would have time for one last question. You don't have to. No pressure. I have, not made it through half of mine.
I'm so sorry.
There's one.
Yeah, so I really love the show, and I was just curious, like, how much do you think, like, thematically about, like, Saul as, like, the current, like, American moment, like, we're obviously in an extremely difficult moment politically and economically and a lot of things in this kind of American capitalist engine that keeps going. How much does that come in? It feels very prescient in a way, or reflective of that, and I was just wondering, how much do you guys talk about that, or, So.
We talk about it, we don't... I think we try to keep the explicit political stuff to a minimum, mostly because it would end up taking up our entire day and make us pull all of our collective hair out. But I think that, certainly the sense of the con being a way to power is a thing that we've felt, that the character has a resonance, and that some of those darker sides of things have felt like things that we can't avoid, that kind of come in, and also just generally that sort of question of like how to be good and how to do the right thing, which seems like such a simple question, but obviously thousands of years of philosophy have not really generated a simple answer. So that I think is how we've kind of tried to navigate it, is in our sort of most sort of simplified dramatic form, but with, we're aware, and we try and kind of make it as connected but not as explicit as we can in some ways.
I think that's what makes our shows almost the opposite of Deutschland 83 and 86, because we, both on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, tried to never state where we were in time.
I was going to ask you that.
know, not we on Breaking
Right.
Bad. We would erase the year from checks and all documents.
Right.
We've had to, because of the HD, had to make some more commitments to dates on Saul on newspapers and such. But we try not just to avoid what year it is, but what season it is. We don't have holidays.
Right, that was my impression, but
We
then I
just-
was like, maybe that's because
Yes.
I
No.
didn't
It was-
catch it.
It's-
Okay.
No,
no
yeah,
that's
season.
the
deliberate.
present.
It is.
Just
We-
always the present.
Most of the time is marked in is personal benchmarks. It's Walt White's birthday in the first show.
Right. So it's 2 years, but
Right.
who's to say when those 2 years?
It's 2 years all of Breaking Bad?
Yes, 50 when he turns 50 to when he turns 52.
And how much before is Better Call Saul from Breaking Bad?
4 years.
4 years from the start. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So we're covering
Oh.
4 years.
But
in
we had to be,
1980.
but weirdly, we had to be more literal on this show about when the dates are, just for our own record, so that they show up, because they show up on checks.
So
and
when
we
are
can
they?
See them. It starts in 2002.
2. Yeah, and so we're mid 2004 now. And part of that is because we put this line in the sand that we're 4 years before, and so we have to make sure we don't cover accidentally 8 years of story, and when he doesn't
Yeah.
quite line up.
But but we've also had to in that same way that we're aware of things, but it feels like certain acknowledgments of season. Like, what would it mean to have a Christmas episode of Breaking Bad? It's like, I don't know what. At some point in there was a Christmas. At some point in there was a 4th of July. Those kinds of
Yeah.
benchmarks we've ignored, and because we know from Breaking Bad, we at least started and we're kind of in contemporary time for a bit. And then got out of sync with it as time went faster than the story time. But because we kind of know what some of the benchmarks are, at some point, one of the writers said, "Oh, this is when we invaded Iraq."
Yes.
And we were like, what do we do with that? Jimmy's reading the newspaper. Iraq. Whoa! Like we had no place for it in the sort of dramatic architecture or the story architecture.
But it's
or even
great to
kind of
liberate
what it
yourself
would.
from that.
Yeah,
I'm
I mean,
desperate to get away from that. Like if I ever hear the top 100 of any year from the 1980s, I'm just going to shoot myself.
The
So done.
soundtrack. And you guys put
No,
out
it's
a
great,
vinyl.
but now,
Right,
we did
that's so
that.
cool.
But it's like, okay,
Yeah.
but never again.
No.
Because you're imprisoned in that year
Yes.
of music, right? Or that was sort of a decision we made creatively at the beginning, and then you really can't use a song from 1991. You
No.
can't do it if
Right.
So it's kind of fun to think about doing other music.
Yeah.
Yes.
Luckily, most of our music, we tend to the tastes of the show tend to be more like 70s yacht rock than they would be contemporary anything.
2003. Yes. Speaking of the vinyl, I would be remiss if I didn't say one of my favorite things about Germany is that this country put out my favorite Breaking Bad merchandise of all time, which was, it's something we can't do in the United States, but it's a series of Blu-rays or DVDs on steelbooks. So like the beautiful collector's edition, collectible version of each season. It was a box set. You could only get it here in the United Kingdom. And we had Ralph Steadman, the artist who is most famous for doing the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas poster. Really bizarre, beautiful artist. He watched the whole series for us on this commission, and he did a different painting for each season that was then imprinted on these steel cases. And I'm going to go searching when we have free time. I'm going to go searching all of the record stores here just to see if I can find a copy because I want one so badly, and they don't have them overseas. So thank you.
Then you'll have to buy a machine to play them.
Yes.
Exactly.
No, they'll just go on our
go on
wall.
the
Great.
Excellent. I wanted to end with. It's great that you're on recommendations because I hope this won't take you by surprise. But I did this the last time around, and 2 weeks ago with Jörg and Tom. And by popular demand, I'm doing this again. And after talking so much about your own work, I thought we conclude with each of you giving us one recommendation of something to watch on TV that you recently saw and
Sure.
want to share.
Well, I know you must have talked about Fleabag at the last time, so I won't say that. And instead, we just watched this wonderful short Irish show called This Way Up. it stars the young woman who's the showrunner and also Sharon Horgan from Catastrophe and many other shows. And it's this beautiful 6 episodes about a woman who has recently had a sort of mental crisis and goes to a facility to recover, and it's about her journey after she gets out, sort of coming back to the world. And despite that description, it is a comedy and it is very funny. So it's very easy to find, I think, on Amazon Prime, Hulu. Yes, and so you could watch the whole thing in a weekend, and it's delightful.
Oh gosh.
You already said RuPaul.
I did already say RuPaul, which I stand by.
Yes. Especially the UK edition that just wrapped up last week.
Excellent.
If you haven't watched it yet.
What would I recommend? I mean, Succession is great, obviously. I'm enjoying Succession. It's a show that I feel like, just to prep for, because he has a new show coming, is Josh Thomas is an Australian who had a show called Please Like Me that was very underwatched. I see at least one person nodding head.
Please Like Me.
Please Like Me.
Please Like Me.
It's
It's
so
great.
fantastic. It's about a young Australian guy who comes out and is sort of coming to terms with his sexuality and his young friends. And it's a show that which sounds very almost cliche. It sounds very just localized. But his mother is mentally ill and constantly in an asylum. Through most of it, and it's very raw and very simple, and it's one of those shows about just feels about empathy, just about like how this character in this small moment. And they did 4 seasons of it, and he has a new show that I'm very much looking forward to that comes out in January. So I would say watch Please Like Me if you haven't.
Please Like Me, which also stars Hannah Gadsby, who did the wonderful stand-up special called Nanette on Netflix a few years ago. It's also a comedy, but it is absolutely gut-wrenching, and it's worth the 45 minutes to watch her monologue.
Yeah.
I've snuck in 2 recommendations.
Oh, you did?
Hannah.
Oh my goodness.
You don't have any time
I
to watch
can't remember
TV
the
right
last
now.
time I watched something like
many
just
shows.
purely for pleasure. I'm drawing a total blank, which is terrible. Oh my God, that's so awful. I can't think. I'm sorry. I'm in post on something.
No worries.
What I really
Yeah,
have done
thanks.
is watch my same thing over and
Yeah,
over and
yeah.
over and over again, like to the point of just so bleary-eyed. But I'm going to think of something.
You'd say 89 for now.
No, definitely not that.
Only because I
Other
just saw
people's
that it's playing here. If you haven't seen Parasite.
That's what I was
Oh,
about to
that's
say.
great.
I was actually about to say that, but then I was
Okay.
like, it's a movie.
No, it's a movie. It's not
You
fair,
asked
but
for
it's
a
still.
series. But yeah, I would say also Parasite.
Yeah.
And it is out now, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, but if not, you should see it tomorrow.
Yes.
Excellent, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.